There you go. Okay. So, guys. This is clearly a contentious issue. Mearsheimer and Walt, 2 years ago, came out with an op-ed in the New York Times arguing that its coverage on Israel issues is pro-Israel. This is in contrast to many things we hear in Oz, and also with the Simon Wiesenthal Center has called the New York Times coverage on Israel so anti-Israel that it's anti-Semitic. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, has refused to write an op-ed in the New York Times, citing its, quote, lack of objectivity. But the New York Times still provides coverage. Clark Hoyt, over and over again, he's the public editor, which is in charge of journalistic ethics and making sure that the newspaper is balanced, has repeatedly come out and said that the New York Times is confident in its coverage on Israel, and that it reports on what happens, not on what people think happens. And with that, do we want to flip a coin? All right. Okay, ready? What is it? Tails. So, Mr. Rapp chooses to go first. Okay. So, Dr. Milowitz, you have 5 minutes, or as long as, or less. Give me a second.
Did everyone vote, by the way?
Yeah, guys, vote. Text 2233 and vote it's true.
The question is, the New York Times is balanced on Israel.
True supports the motion and false is against the motion.
Okay, so true, you think it's balanced?
You're
true.
Just give me a second to...
Okay, so you can text them out. Ready, set, go.
So, all right. So there's no doubt in my mind that somebody who's been reading the New York Times for at least about 37 years, since I was 10. Well, let's say 35 years. That the Times does everything in its power, has always done, to be as balanced and as fair as it can be on all different issues. I don't think that the issue of Israel is central in any way to the New York Times editorial board. I don't think they treat Israel any differently than they treat Syria or Russia or anything like that. I think that in this community, this relatively homogeneous community, there's a feeling that the New York Times is not a propagandist or a supporter of everything that Israel does. And I think that that perception has made people make these statements that coverage of Israel is either unbalanced, unfair, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel. And then they'll say things like, well, it's because it's all Jews or liberal Jews are running the paper, and they're guilty, and they want to bend over backwards to be fair to the Arabs, and to the Palestinians, and to the Egyptians, and to all the other people. And so coverage ends up being tilted against Israel, against Jews, and so forth. And I didn't do a study of it. I can't give you this 20 articles for, 85 articles against. I'm sure you could, anybody could pick up one particular day and say, oh look, there was a bombing, and they showed pictures of dead Palestinians rather than dead Israelis, and say, therefore, and it's usually pictures, that's what everybody tends to argue about. It's the pictures that connote some sort of justice that's equal sentiment for the Israelis or for the victims of Israeli violence. So, my opinion, and I think it's valid, that the New York Times, as probably the premier international newspaper, is doing all that it can to be as fair, as objective as is possible, given the fact that pure objectivity is an impossibility. Especially in our world today, when the internet allows you to only go to pro-your-thing sites. You know there are people in this school who they will only look at things that agree with them. And the internet allows you to do that. You go right to all the opinions that are on your side. I think that we need the New York Times more than ever because it is And whether it fails or succeeds on a particular day is beside the point. It tries its very best to be as fair as it can be. Is that going to satisfy people who are 100% supporters of Israel and everything it does? No way. But you could argue that the New York Times is biased against the New York Mets. You could argue that it's biased against the Giants or rather than the Jets based on how many news articles there are. But the fact of the matter is that if you are a fan of something, you're never going to feel that the coverage is accurate. But I'm here to tell you that it doesn't.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Mr. Rapp, your 5-minute opener.
So, the statements that Alex brought up at the beginning, I probably disagree with all of them. I don't think the New York Times is biased pro-Israel, and I certainly don't think the New York Times coverage is at all anti-Semitic. I do think the New York Times lacks objectivity. I think pretty much every publication that exists lacks objectivity. I want to actually present my case to you in two parts. In the first part, I want to give you a little bit of a history of the Times, which comes from a book called The Kingdom and the Power, which is a book about the history of the Times. The book goes into describing a bit about the Ox family and what types of Jews they were. And I want to bring this up because I think it speaks to the idea that there is a sympathetic feeling towards the Palestinians as a result of Jewish guilt, which I don't think there's any evidence for. I do think there's evidence that the publishers of the New York Times, and particularly the publishing family and the sort of historical identity of the paper, was founded in the German Haskalah movement. It was founded among Jews of German descent who believed very strongly that Judaism was something that happened inside synagogue and not outside. I think you'll even find Rabbi Joseph Lookstein's famous quote of yarmulke as an indoor garment, which everyone in Ramaz today seems to really buy into seriously, that is in that same vein. That the idea that your Judaism is your religion, and it's something that's very private to you as your faith, but that your national identity is not something that you associate with Judaism, to the extent, by the way, that Reform Judaism did not accept the idea of Zionism until the 1990s. The idea in principle of there being a state of Israel. Really, Reform Judaism was founded on this idea that Judaism was a religious faith choice and not a national identity. I think that infuses the thinking of the Times. I don't have evidence for this, but I think it would be silly to assume that a paper's publisher didn't influence, to some extent, how that paper reports its news. And this brings me to my second point, and that is the lack of objectivity in anything. Anytime you present a story, you are selecting a number of facts, and they are facts, right? You're selecting a number of facts from an infinite field of other facts. Right? And you can't present all the facts. That's an impossibility. And so the facts that you choose, as factual as they are, right, present a certain side of the story. Now, what I think has happened with the New York Times over time is the side of the story that the New York Times presents on Israel is not anti-Israel, but it has an agenda. Right? Originally, when the organizers of the debate approached me about the resolve, the New York Times is anti-Israel, I wasn't willing to debate that. Because I don't think the New York Times is any more anti-Israel than Yediot or Ma'ariv or any of the Israeli newspapers that present opinions on the Israeli establishment that are more often than not to the left of what the New York Times presents. But that does not absolve the New York Times of being of taking an agenda on Israel. Right? And the very fact, as Dr. Milowitz points out, that this community feels that its voice is not accurately represented in the Times is in and of itself evidence that the Times is not fair and balanced. That doesn't mean the Times is biased against anyone, but it certainly means the Times is not balanced. Right? The fact that there is a Wall Street Journal that presents a different side of the coin implies that both papers are not fair and balanced. And actually, the idea of being balanced is not a responsibility of a publisher, but a responsibility of the reader to incorporate as much information as possible and sort through that. So to sum up, I think that both the history of the paper, has a very particular view on Jews in the world, and that's the influence of the publisher, and that has infused a agenda regarding Israel that is left of center, or, well, that's sort of a silly term, but depending on where your center is, but it's certainly to the left of, let's say, the Wall Street Journal, and therefore, by its definition, is biased. But it is also to the right of Yediot and Ma'ariv.
Thank you, Mr. Rapp. So now we're going to do 2-minute responses to what the opposing debater said.
So I need to go?
You get to go. 2 minutes. On
So
what
to the
Mr.
right, you say that the New York Times is to the left of the Wall Street Journal. I would put it like right in the middle, it seems to me. Because the Wall Street Journal is clearly it's basically a propagandist for a more conservative perspective. I think that the Times probably leans liberal on a lot of issues. If you see who they choose for most elected offices, they usually choose a Democrat. But I do also think that given that objectivity, perfect objectivity is an impossibility, which I agree with you, I think that we're in some way in agreement in saying that, well, it's not anti-Semitic, it's not anti-Israel, so there's not that much that we're really disagreeing with here, except this kind of little point about can objectivity, in fact, be fulfilled on any given in a newspaper. So my argument would be, given the world that we live in, the Times is as close to that objective standard as I've seen. And as I say, given a world where people are reading things almost always in support of their own opinions and then emailing them to each other so they can all celebrate how they all agree and feel the same way about everything, I think that the New York Times is doing a tremendous service in at least attempting, in a very diligent way, to investigate itself and to ask itself, do we have an agenda about Israel, about Libya, about America, about everything? They're a constantly self-analyzing organization. That's why they have a public editor. That's why every Sunday there's a guy, or I think in this case a woman, who analyzes anything she wants. And she's paid by the New York Times, but she cannot be fired. And what? She cannot be fired, and she cannot be rehired. So she's completely objective, and that's kind of the goal of the newspaper.
Thank you, Dr. Milowitz.
So, Dr. Milowitz,
and also, I'm just kidding.
Dr. Milowitz and I he's right that we do agree on certain points, but not on almost everything. I think we disagree on more than you think. I actually think the public editor is an interesting point to bring up, because the public editor was a position that was born out of the reporter who was discovered to have been fabricating stories for an extended period of time, fabricating facts. And I do agree with you, Dr. Milowitz, that the New York Times is probably the best example of a publication that I know of that is self-reflective. But I think it's self-reflective on its reporting of facts. I think it's very careful to make sure that it reports facts accurately. I think it doesn't give as much consideration, nor maybe should it, to which facts it chooses to present. And so I think, unlike you, if there is an article about, let's say, a terrorist attack, and the picture in the article is of the Israeli retaliation to that terrorist attack, and it's of I recall this being something, but it could just be something like this, of a small Palestinian child in front of a large Israeli tank. And this upset lots of people because this was a Palestinian-initiated terrorist attack, and this is the picture that you would choose. I don't think that picture is chosen randomly or without forethought. But I think the New York Times feels that that's fair to do because of the role that is the size of the Israeli military, right? The nature of the fight that as they see it, right, between Israelis and Palestinians and the territory. And so even though that picture does present a disproportionate, by the nature of it being a picture, by the nature of the picture, presents a disproportionate view, the Times consciously makes that choice to present that point of view. And that in and of itself is unbalanced. And that's the agenda, to a certain extent, of the paper. That agenda is not necessarily anti-Israel, because there are voices within Israel's democracy that would agree with that assessment and analysis of the situation. So to say the New York Times hates Israel is equally false. Shut up.
Ignore him, man. Okay, so before we move to student questions, I want to ask a question. This is directed at...
Because he's slightly above the level of student.
Mr. Rapp, you said that you don't think the New York Times is anti-Israel. Why then, and Dr. Milowitz dealt with this, why, I was in the elevator before, and I was talking to Rabbi Lichstein, and I was all like, you should come to the RamPo debate. We're talking about whether the New York Times is balanced on Israel. And he goes, why do I need to come? It's obvious. Why?
Yes.
Yeah. Why do you think it's such a prevalent view among our community and among many communities like us that the New York Times has an anti-Israel agenda?
I think that Dr. Milowitz's analogy of your sports team is fair. I think that let's use the sports analogy. So I'm a Mets fan, and I would rather watch the Mets when they're 10 games under 500 than watch the Yankees competing for a pennant, because I'm a Mets fan. When I look at the paper the next day, the Yankees get far more coverage than the Mets do. And that's because the Times is choosing that in response to what it thinks is appropriate based on how it can allocate space and coverage. But I'm still a Mets fan. I feel strongly about that. I think that's a really good analogy. I think the Jewish community in general, I'm going to give you an answer to this, which was first expressed by a guy named Rich Cohen, who writes for The New Yorker. And he also wrote a book called Israel is Real, which I encourage you to read. He was basically a Midwestern Jew with no particular knowledge of Israel the way we all have. Did not grow up through a Jewish day school system. Was a reporter writing for The New Yorker, and obviously was exposed, writing for The New Yorker, to the sort of New York, Los Angeles pro-Israel scene, and decided to go out and research Israel for himself. And he writes a popular book that describes the history of Jewish presence in Israel from the destruction of the Second Temple until modern times. And one of the things he talks about is that after the Temple was destroyed and Jews spread off into the rest of the world, the idea of Israel for most of that history was an abstraction. It was not something that was contextual and real. And we actually see this in our liturgy, where we talk about the Israel, we talk about Zion, we talk about in Shmon Esrei and in Tefillah, is something that we're yearning for, that's messianic, that may come in some end of days vision. And that impression of Israel hit a wall when modern Zionism came into being, and people actually began to realize Israel in reality. Right? And all of a sudden, Israel was not an idealized thing, but it was a real country and a real nation. Every nation has blood on its hands, and every nation makes choices that are poor, and has to choose between two bad immoral choices and decide which one is less immoral, and so on. And as someone who supports the state of Israel and classifies myself as a Zionist, I think Israel does often a very good job of that. Not always, but often does a very good job of checking itself. But I think the Jewish view in the diaspora, to a certain extent, is still stuck in that pre-Zionist, post-destruction of the temple view of Israel. We still like to see Israel as this perfect, idealized thing. When, if you walked into an Israeli coffee house, no one in there sees Israel as a perfect or idealized thing. They're quite comfortable criticizing Israel, and even seeing Israel as mistaken and immoral and often way misguided. But in the American Jewish community, there is still sort of this discomfort with the idea of criticizing Israel. Maybe that's because we feel more insular towards the outside, and we feel we need to protect Israel. We can criticize it amongst ourselves, but what would we say when someone else? There could be all those reasons. But I think that's a true trend in the Jewish community.
Thank you, Mr. Rapp. All right. Questions from you guys?
I don't get a question.
Oh, do you want to ask?
Well,
Well, I was gonna ask.
Don't you know your response.
I was gonna ask about the history of the Jewish stuff, but
Let me just tell you this thing.
Okay.
It's like you take Philip Roth, just to go with this. And we like to bring it up. In America, he was considered when he was writing his books as anti-Semitic. Goes to Israel, he was celebrated. So it's the same thing. There's no anti-Semitism in the New York Times. There's much more critical view, which is easily digested in Israel, and not so easily digested here, where there's more guilt that you're not in Israel, and there's more a sense of self-protection and fear, all that other stuff. But again,
So we agree on this
it's a demon that you create that our community, this community, not so much, has created rather than is really there. I would say that to whoever looks to you.
I'm sure he'd love to hear that. Thank you, Dr. Milowitz. Dan.
Sorry for being the first one. So the current bureau chief of the Jerusalem bureau chief of the New York Times is Jody Roderin. Is that her name? Roderin. And she's pretty left wing and not left wing, but she's liberal. I mean, that's fair.
Who's your question for?
I guess you could say. Can you just pose it there?
Sure.
So she's left wing. The previous bureau chief is also liberal. Ethan Bronner, I think his name is Bronner. So do you think a liberal publication is either taking the New York Times is liberal? So do you think liberal is giving the true facts on Israel, or is it giving a skewed vision? Because the New York Times identifies itself as a left wing or liberal.
So my answer is skewed.
So do you think politics plays a role in how a publication like the New York Times? Do you think, especially you?
I would say the opposite. I'd say that because the New York Times is always supporting liberal or left politicians, that more recently they try to redress that balance by giving fair treatment to the people who they are as behind.
So you think they're more so fair?
Right, but Dr. Milowitz, you would agree, though, that there's certain things the New York Times rules out. So, for example, the Likud platform, as it's written, calls for an establishment of a Jewish state on both sides of the Jordan River. Right? And there are people who believe that Jews, as ethnic Jews, have the right to the land, and they should deport any Arabs who live on that land.
Yeah.
And the New York Times, and that is a thought-out philosophy, and it, for argument's sake, it has its roots in history. Right? And yet the New York Times rules that out as something that is worth reporting. It passes a judgment on that philosophy.
I don't know that it passes.
And that's Likud.
I mean, I don't know that it passes a judgment on it necessarily. It does maybe in its editorial page, but it certainly, I don't think it does in terms of its reporting of the news. It just tells you what that group of people believe and think. There are.
But you don't find too many articles on it. Right? You don't find too many articles on
No, because it is not. It's probably more of a fringe position than a central position. No.
Yeah, that probably is.
People who vote for Likud don't vote based on that. Sarah.
I mean, just to address that point, that'd be like saying, well, the Wall Street Journal doesn't have any articles on Hamas's platform, which is that, we should.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
But it's not that the New York Times is against the Israeli right that they don't even bother reporting it because they don't see it as worthwhile. They don't see it as worthwhile because the New York Times as an American publication, I really don't see them striving for one side or the other. I really see them striving, as most American publications, as to just get whatever problems that are there resolved, and they don't see.
Don't you see that as in and of itself an agenda? I agree with you that the Wall Street Journal.
It's an agenda, but it's not an agenda for Israel for Palestine over Israel or Israel over Palestine. They see the Likud platform or the Hamas platform as.
I completely agree with you that the New York Times does not have an agenda against Israel, or Palestine over Israel, Israel over Palestine. I think the New York Times has a generally liberal agenda. That what would be considered liberal within Israel. Actually, not as liberal as you'll get in Israel, but still liberal within Israel. And that's its agenda. And just like the Wall Street Journal has a conservative agenda. And if you're liberal, it's easy to say that that's wrong and biased, and if you're conservative, it's easy to look the other way. But it's impossible to be balanced.
And I would say that the agenda of the New York Times is to try to be as balanced as they can be in every case, and to redress that or address it when they fail.
Thank you, Dr. Milowitz. Daniel Bracken.
So, sort of in the broader landscape of the media, a lot of people think, and I sort of agree, I mean, I'm liberal myself, but that sort of the media as a whole takes a liberal point of view on Israel. They like to show more. I mean, I was reading an article that I think somebody posted about how 30 years, no, it was more, it was like 40 years ago by now. No, it was 30. It was this big massacre. And pretty much there were these two big massacres, and one of them Israel sort of in a tiny bit participated in and got a huge media attention, and then
Israel allowed it to
didn't.
happen.
Yeah.
In other words, they went in and the Israeli army stood, they went into this refugee camp, Christian Lebanese, and they slaughtered people in the refugee camp, and Israeli, so it's now been established as fact. Israel was outside, heard what was going on, every soldier was there, reported on hearing horrific screams, and they understood what was going on, and they allowed it to happen. It was Christian Palestinians against Muslim Palestinians.
So, I mean, and then there was another massacre where it was the same group or the same sect who attacked them, and it wasn't really, I mean, nothing happened because Israel wasn't involved, and I mean, there's sort of a widespread view that the media is against Israel. So do you think that the New York Times is simply participating in this, or the New York Times being sort of the newspaper of record puts it sets the standard that it does and people follow, and it really influences others, or they're simply part of a larger picture and they don't have so much influence in themselves?
Look, what I think is, I don't think there is this thing called media. The media is a conglomeration of lots of different medias, and each of them comes with a idea of which set of hopefully facts they want to present, and often it doesn't take a genius to realize that lots of times they're not presenting facts at all, they're presenting whatever they like to. I think the New York Times is tremendously influential, which is probably why we get such an agitated reaction, because leaders of the world do read the New York Times. And what's published on their editorial page even is influential on people. And that's, I think, in many ways still the gold standard of media coverage. And I do agree with Dr. Milowitz that they do a better job than just about any other publication at establishing fact. I think that what I would say is that fact and fairness are not necessarily the same.
But you're talking about that particular situation. So the massacre where it involves Israel is a country. The other is groups that are. So it's only because it's not because it's Israel. It's because here the army of a particular country allowed this to happen. That's sort of that's big news.
And if you went back to 1967, Daniele, right? The Israel was the darlings of the media because Israel was seen as a smaller country, right? Not just being having aggressors from all the other Arab countries, but the Soviet Union, right? The arch enemy of the United States, as sort of pushing Arab countries. So it was a proxy war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And so in that instance, I think U.S. publications were probably more likely to present a favorable view on Israel. While now that dynamic no longer exists, Israel is not a proxy for the United States in its war against the Soviet Union, and if anything, another dynamic exists where Israel is a large, economically successful, militarily mighty country that is in a situation where it is imposing restrictions on a population that does not have any of those resources. And that's a story that in and of it, that shifts the entire dynamic in terms of how you're going to present and favor that each side of those stories.
I agree with you.
Thank you, Mr. Rapp. Ms. Rapp.
So kind of speaking to this fact versus fairness thing, which I think is what the center of the argument is about. Like, it's not about whether they're getting the facts wrong. I think that both Mr. Rapp and Mr. Milowitz are agreeing to that. I'm curious, my feeling is, and you can both respond to this, can this argument really mean the question of the New York Times' balance on Israel? We've kind of been making these macro arguments, and I wonder if the argument can really be made without looking at the micro elements, which is small things like linguistics or word usage, or can we analyze every single time a picture from the Middle East conflict is there on the page and what is shown in that picture, or when the words that are used to describe Israel are the lists of words that are like different.
So that's a whole different issue.
Right, because I've read, and I could be wrong here, that that whenever, especially in the Times, like their editing team, I think, is like known for really looking at an article not just for facts, but to look at kind of the linguistic effects of words that are used. And I wonder if we can even have this argument without looking at the micro level of the package or the form in which the facts are shaped, kind of thing.
That would have required us to do research. We weren't getting paid for this. But if we did research, I think what you would find is I'd rather just hypothesize than actually do the research. Is that you could put together a document that shows anti-Semitic, anti-Israel propaganda. Easy. By cutting some pictures out and putting them together and showing and picking, they don't call it Judea and Samaria, they call it, right, all that kind of thing, right? So, they call them guerrillas or terrorists or whatever they call freaks, I don't know. You always look at the language.
Freedom fighters.
Whatever.
Freedom fighters.
Right. So, or you could, I think you could easily put a dossier together contrary to that. That, to me, makes the point. Now, if that's true, if my hypothesis is true, I invite you all to do that over the next few months, to collect data. But I think that you could create an equally voluminous document on the pro-Israel side and on the anti-Israel side from the New York Times, thereby balancing out the seesaw, showing that the Times is, in fact, trying to be balanced and is, to a greater or less, to a certain extent, succeeding where other organizations fail.
So I agree and disagree with you. I think that you could create that dual document, right? But it would still depend on where your position of pro-Israel starts from. So that would influence ultimately which anecdotes you see as significant. And it's interesting you brought up Judea and Samaria, right? So for a lot of people, right, the West Bank is called the West Bank because the United Nations never recognized it as sovereign territory of Israel, right? And so that's not necessarily an anti-Israel point to not call it Judea and Samaria, but if your view on the Zionist enterprise and the ideas behind the state of Israel include Judea and Samaria as being part of Israel, then you might see that as being anti-Israel. So I agree with you, Ms. Krupka, that actually the right way to do this would be to somehow analyze all of this microdata and put it into some sort of analysis that could convincingly make an argument one way or the other. Or I think probably an easier way to get to that point would be to have an inside story from someone on the editorial board who was at the meetings, who felt that there was some undue pressure put in a particular way to show this photograph or choose this language or something like that. And those are all interesting points. What's interesting is also that hasn't happened. You haven't had an employee of the New York Times get up and say, I had to resign in disgust because I felt the New York Times wasn't fairly reporting on Israel. I think that the larger issue here is really that Israel is a state that exists by virtue of ideas. Ideas that we either consent to or don't consent to. And to the extent that we buy into those ideas is going to greatly influence what we see as fair and unfair on Israel. And we have to, as a Jewish community, do a better job of recognizing the fact that not everyone agrees with our ideas. And that is exactly why we fight for them, and why we argue about them, and why we believe in them. But they're not necessarily everyone else's ideas.
Eddie.
So this is a question for Dr. Milowitz. So if we take, if we agree with what you said, that the New York Times is not biased against Israel and it's completely objective as possible, but let's say the New York Times has an absence of reporting on Israel and emphasis. It doesn't report on Israel on every issue they possibly can. They don't report on certain issues; they just leave them out. But they put an emphasis on Palestinian issues. Wouldn't you call that bias in and of itself, just an absence of reporting on certain issues, and then an emphasis on another issue?
If they did that?
If they did that, and do you think they do that?
I
don't think they do that. If they did that, that's a hard thing to say. I mean, it depends what's going on in the world, you know, what's happening. Why are we talking more about the Palestinians? Well, maybe something, I mean, like Egypt is in the newspaper every day now because lots of stuff is going on in Israel, you know, in Egypt. Whereas Israel, like today in the paper here, centrist party in Israel introduces civil union measures. That seems fairly fair to me. Then you get this emotional gulf renewed as Israel frees prisoners. Well, that you could argue is pro-Palestinian because it talks about how the people who are waiting for those prisoners to come home feel so overwhelmed with emotion, and then it only secondarily talks about the fact that maybe they killed people when they were, and that's why they were in jail. But again, it's the story of the day. It's simply what happened. How you frame it, yeah, I don't think it's a organizational agenda, though. I think it's this particular writer and that editor who put together that headline thought this would be the most interesting or the most honest or the most fruitful way of getting this information across.
I would just say that I think there's probably, I have no reason I have no proof for this, but I think that in any paper, and the New York Times is no exception, there's a gap between the writers and the editors. And you'll often hear writers complain about this, unrelated sports writers often complain about this, where they write an article where they feel that they portrayed the athlete fairly, and the editor put an incendiary headline on the article, and then the athlete gets upset at the reporter, even though it was the editor who chose the headline. I think that papers often have a gap.
I'm curious, though, about the people here, if there's anybody who really thinks the paper is anti-Semitic, forget about bias or not, the really all the way extreme. I'm interested, like, what do you imagine is the goal there? Like, do you think the New York Times is this insidious organization whose one big job, role is to undermine Israel autonomy? I mean, what's the goal there? They hate Israel, they hate Jews. If that's the case, they're doing a very poor job of it. They're really not making this happen in a very productive way.
It's a secret subtlety.
It's very subtle.
I would say that
It's like a reverse.
I think it's like the history of like the more coded feelings towards Jews sometimes happen underlying of other
I
things.
understand, but
But doesn't that hit on the point, right? That Jews feel their feelings, right? That the New York Times may just be a reflection of divisions within the Jewish community as to what the role of Israel is, as much as it's the difference between Jews and not
I mean,
Jews.
it's also a reflection of its demographic, which is northeastern United States. I think there are actually many non-Jews who would feel that the Times is not balanced, and as though they just live in the Midwest and we don't really know that because of where we live. So we're also looking at this
they would think it
very,
would be unbalanced
from a very certain
in terms of
demographic.
the New York Times' favorite.
Like, I
makes
disagree
New
that it's
York
only
favorite
our
rather
community
than,
that feels that way. I think that's not necessarily true. I just think we live in a community where anyone who's non-Jewish.
We're in a very sensitive community, with good reason. It's a bad history, it's a tough time. It's a lot of bad things have happened. Everyone's worried. Israel's a small democracy surrounded by lunatics. And that's the way it is. By the way, I read the New York Times, and that's my opinion. So the fact is that what was I saying? I lost myself. What?
You live in a sensitive community.
Yeah, we're very sensitive. So the point is, if it's not a hooray Israel in the New York Times, the assumption therefore is it's boo, we hate Israel. And you're not going to get a legitimate newspaper to celebrate any country or any group just blindly. You're not going to say, well, Israel, let me just make sure that it's clear that Israel did this, but it was because 1,000 years ago, blah, blah, blah. You can't do that. And that's what you're looking for. That's what people are looking for. And I would argue that that's a mistake, that's not the job of the newspaper. The newspaper is not a PR representative for anybody. And it should do its best to offend everybody. I guarantee you, Palestinians who read the New York Times, who live, people, they think it's biased towards Israel. I'm sure right-wingers think it's left-wing. Left-wingers think it's, I'm sure of it. I'm sure we could have, in some sort of, bizarro yeshiva where they, Islamic school, they're debating whether the New York Times is against Islam. I'm sure. It's just the way that we see. We're so narrow-minded that I don't mean you are all narrow-minded. I mean that we tend to be so fearful that when we see a picture, one picture, all of a sudden it takes over our emotional
But
lives.
there's a difference, and see, this is where I agree with you on that, but where I would part with you is that that very fact, the fact that we all have such a varying degree of opinions, and I would add, in response to Ms. Krupa, that exists within the Jewish community as well. And if you rewinded in time and went back to before 1948, most of the Orthodox Jewish community, the vast majority of the Orthodox Jewish community, was against the establishment of the State of Israel and published a lot about that. And then once the state was established, it just sort of became reality, and the small movement within Orthodoxy grew substantially to support the State of Israel. But these are, even within the Jewish community, there's a lot of feeling about Zionism and what Zionism means. But because of that, I think it's impossible to say that it doesn't influence the times. It's impossible to say that that the editors have no opinion on this matter, and that there isn't sort of not a conspiracy-based effort to try and say this instead of that, but in the inclusion of what are deemed relevant facts to include and what are deemed irrelevant facts to include, right? They choose the facts that they see as relevant, as authoritarian. Judea and Samaria, not a fact, maybe, for one person, but a fact for someone else. And that in and of itself is bias.
Given that there's only a certain amount of room in any paper, choices have to be made, and you're right. The choices I make are going to be determined by the way that I perceive reality, and that is not going to be completely objective. And so, yes, in that way, the New York Times, like every other organization, will show its hand to a certain extent. But if it hires enough different people, if it tries, it bends over backwards to edit itself and reflect on itself, it will get closer, as I say, to that middle ground that is its ultimate goal.
Gladback, the other question.
Directed to Mr. Rapp. On the point that you made about the Six-Day War and the Arab aggressors and the Soviet support to the Arab aggressors, so would you say that would you believe that the only reason why the New York Times perceived Israel justly was because of its proxy war, or like in the future, or any time do a separate issue?
Well, okay, I don't know exactly how the New York Times reported on Israel during the Six-Day War, mainly because I wasn't alive. But what I will say is this: if you speak to anyone who was alive, and Israel was far more the darlings, or considered the darlings of the U.S. media in that time than it is today. And I think that is directly attributed to two things. First of all, it was the underdog, and America forever loves an underdog story. It was democracy. Arab countries were clearly dictatorships. It was a proxy war between the U.S. To a certain extent, it was perceived as a proxy war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And in fact, it wasn't until Levi Eshkol, who was the prime minister during the Six-Day War, came and met with Lyndon Johnson after the Six-Day War and convinced Lyndon Johnson that the Soviets were rearming the Arabs, after Israel had done so much damage to Arab arms, that the arms connection that still exists, that all of you who are in AIPAC advocate for today, it was established. So that argument was made to Lyndon Johnson in those meetings, that this should be seen as a proxy.
So follow up? Sure. So in the future, I'm asking, do you believe that Israel will be depicted only in a just nature because of a separate issue?
I think Israel will, until it can, if it can ever, deal with Palestinians who are not given the same protection under the law as Israeli citizens are. Right? Until it can deal with that issue, that will overhang on everything that Israel has to produce publicly. Every media, PR issue Israel has, that will be an overhang, because that is a real issue. That is an issue that needs to be, for fair-minded intellectual people, needs to be dealt with. I don't think there's an easy solution to that issue. What I also think is the Israeli public wants to deal with that issue. And the majority of Israelis believe that it's unfair. I think majority of Israelis also believe that they don't really have a solution at this point. And we can argue whether or not that's true, but I think that issue will always overhang.
Sarah, and then
Just to clarify the point that was just made, so you said that going back to the proxy war, that the New York Times was more likely to support Israel, pre-67 because there was a proxy war going on between the United States and the USSR, that we had to support our allies as opposed to the USSR's allies, but then there are two separate issues. There's the proxy war issue, and then there's a Palestinian issue, then there's the occupation issue, and they were happening simultaneously. The Palestinian issue happened in 1967 when Israel went into the West Bank, but the proxy war continued until the late 80s when the USSR disbanded. I mean, we were still fighting proxy wars in Afghanistan in the 80s, and the Palestinian issue was a big issue, especially during the first Lebanon War.
Yeah, but what's interesting is Oslo, you don't see Oslo start, which is the US-led peace effort, until the late 1980s, early 1990s when the Soviet Union fell. So there wasn't a lot of initiative to deal with the Palestinian issue on either side. And that's part of the problem Israel got itself into, is everyone just sort of ignored the issue right after 67, with the exception, by the way, I will say, of Yeshayahu Leibowitz, who's a philosopher, who's also Nechama Leibowitz's brother, who probably studied in Tanakh, who was the first person in 1967, right after the war, to say that Israel has a moral problem here, and was almost universally laughed off the scene within Israel, but turned out to be somewhat prophetic in his ideas, because Israel did have a moral problem that no one wanted to deal with.
So you really think
Yigal alone also.
So
you really do think that the New York Times, let's say for argument's sake, that there is a bias, that their bias towards Israel was based on not whether or not Israel was right or wrong in its actions, but whether or not it was politically necessary for us to support Israel in our war against.
I think the New York Times in general, right, has a particular view of what fairness, democracy, equality, what ethic, what's right and wrong in a given society, and that point of view influences how it reports the news. And I think that point of view was less in conflict with Israeli action when they were part of a bigger conflict against dictatorships and so on, or because no one was focusing on it and we all overlooked it. And now it's Israel's point of view, or the Israeli government's policies are more in conflict with the New York Times view on what's right and wrong. And that's all bias. And that's just the nature of human thought.
Thank you, Mr. Rapp. Dan has a question about. Oh, Oren. Sorry.
I just a quick question about. I know we've been talking a lot about the reporting and the articles in the New York Times. What are your views on the editorials, though, on the op-eds? Do you feel?
I would say.
Just quickly.
Trying to wrap this up. Go ahead.
Do you feel that maybe those are a little bit more skewered and like they're choosing the opinions that bias towards Israel, against Israel, or do you feel like those are a little, there's more leeway there because it's really just?
I think that in particular the op-ed section, the editorials or the op-eds?
Good distinction.
The op-eds where people are invited to write or send in things that are then accepted or rejected, I think, again, bends over backwards to try to be as balanced as it can be. You have, for years, you had William Safire, who was a staunch supporter of Israel. You had A.M. Rosenthal, overwhelmingly. He was the editor. He was the editor-in-chief of the paper. He was Rosenthal. He was such a supporter of Israel. So that's when the argument just goes out the window right there. But anyway,
the truth is Rosenthal didn't start out that way. He did become more conservative as time went on. But look, William Safire was a speechwriter for Nixon. He wasn't. He was
right wing as could be.
I actually agree with Dr. Milowitz that on the op-ed
And then you had lefties there too.
And you'll see, by the way,
and you had
you'll see what they do. If they had an article by Benjamin Netanyahu, although apparently he refuses to write now, but if they had an op-ed by him, the next week they'd have an op-ed by a Palestinian.
Right.
They do a good job. The editor, but I would ask you to address the editorials, which are on the left side.
I'll do the editorials in a second. But Netanyahu is doing himself no favors, and it's never a good idea to simply say, well, I'm not going to write for the New York Times. Here they're giving him, here's space where you can show your perspective, your point of view. Why would you say I don't want it to be there? That's absurd. You know?
But what about
show
the,
your point
what
of
about
view.
the
You're inviting
editorials,
it.
which is when the editorial board gets together
The
and says, this is
editorials
what we think.
have no objectivity. There's no objectivity in the editorials. And if you want to find out what the editor, the board of editors feels about Israel, all you got to do is read the.
But then aren't
and
you?
that's the beauty, because if it turns out that all the editorials, or a number of them, 80%, are critical of Israel, they've now put it out there. They're saying, okay, there's where we are, so you know, we're not hiding it. There's not a backroom deal.
There's no backroom deal. But this is the great thing, is that they put it out there, and the editors are clearly left of center, and I wouldn't even say bias against Israel. They're clearly left of center on Israel, right?
Definitely.
And then, in your mind, there's something where they go through of self-reflection
Yes.
and so on, that eliminates that bias, even though they've clearly presented themselves having that bias.
Yes.
So I think that's
That's
not the
called
case. I think when
journalism.
they publish those pictures, that belies their bias.
No.
Not the lies, the traits.
The trays, it doesn't. It exposes their bias.
Alright, so Dan is
Listen,
around the
I think we all know who won.
Guys, Alan,
I'm just